Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? Thank you so much for being here today. I am Chris of the Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out all about that show if you decide to look it up at chrisandchristineshow.com. And I will put a link to that into the show notes today of today's episode. So don't you even worry about a little thing. And if you want to find out more about me, Podtastic Audio, you can go to podtasticaudio.com. And that will also be into the show notes of today's episode. As you try to explain to people you meet in the street all about your podcast, one thing I did say before was to get very simple and very easy to make, business cards for your podcast, because if you're out in the wild, you're like, hey, I have a podcast, check it out. Oh, hey, what is it? Oh, here's a business card. And they get their business card, and on your card, what I have done on the back side is I put a QR code to the actual, link to the website or link to whatever it possibly could be. Probably the website is probably the best place to send a new listener, because from there, hopefully you'll have links to, Apple, links to Spotify, links to wherever you want them to listen to the podcast. Because remember, not everybody has an iPhone. I know, shocker, really. Some people have Android phones and they use Spotify or the Google podcast player, or there's, a million different podcast players out there. I mean, just pick your choice, whatever. But your listener to your podcast, just give them options. So I like to send everybody to the website, because the website's got links for their choice. They can pick whatever they want to listen to it on. All the choices are there for them right in front of them. But I was kind of thinking about this a while back. I mentioned this about creating QR codes for your podcast accessibility. So for example, with a business card, you put the QR code on the back side of the card so that you can give your card out and they would just scan it and go straight to whatever your content is. But I was kind of thinking, what if you're out there and you don't have your cards with you? Because that's happened to me quite a bit. I mentioned, I got a podcast. Oh, what is it? How do you type it in? How do you spell that? All that stuff. What's the website called? Let me type it in. Or are you on Spotify? Or are you whatever? So I had this brilliant idea today. I'm thinking, I got that QR code creator app on my phone. There's a couple of them to look it up. Find one that works best for you. Anyways, what I would do is I'm thinking about creating specific QR codes for different areas you want to send potentially a new listener. So say you meet somebody in the wild, hey, I got a podcast, and you say, hey, do you listen to podcasts? And say, yeah, I do. What do you like to listen to, on Apple or on Spotify or what? Oh, yeah, I got iPhone to listen on Apple. So create a QR code for your Apple podcast link, and you just have it on your phone on your pictures, save it in its own special gallery on your iPhone. That way it doesn't get mixed in with all the other pictures you got. That way you pull that up, and then you can even write on top of it, because I got a few apps that help me create the episode artwork. So the same kind of tool I use to make that, I can make a QR code, and on top of the QR code, I can write in big old fat font, this is the Podtastic Audio Apple link. So when I see the picture, I know exactly what this goes to. So all I have to do is, hey, you have a podcast? You want to listen to my podcast? So here, all you have to do, hey, you got a phone with you? Yeah, okay, great. Aim your camera at this image. You pull the image up on your phone, and you just show it to them, and they just instantly take their camera and take a snapshot, or however it works, or the QR codes, and then it goes into their Apple account and pulls it right up, instant. There's no card that has to be exchanged. There's no telling them the name, how to spell your podcast. There's no oh, it's this and this at .com or .net. You don't have to have them type anything in. Makes it very quick and easy. It kind of eliminates the whole exchanging of business cards back and forth. I just thought about this today. So especially if you want to send them directly to Spotify, or directly to your Apple account, or directly to your website, direct. You can make one QR code for each thing. In fact, as soon as we're done doing this podcast today, I'm going to go on my phone and I'm going to start creating like links to all of those so that if I do meet somebody out in the wild and, hey, you got a podcast, well, check it out. Give me your phone, scan this, and you're already there. Very easy. Makes it very quick. And you should be all about making things very easy for your listener or even potential listener to get access to your content. Don't make them go through hoops. If anybody has to go through lots of hoops to get to your content, they're already done. They're checking out, man. You want to put as minimal effort in as possible to get into the good stuff, right? Get me to the good stuff as soon as you can. So that is my basic, simple tip of the day I just thought about just now. So I'm always coming up with great ideas and great things. I keep popping my head all the time. Oh, that'd be a great idea. Or I should try that. Don't be afraid to always evolve your podcast, and don't be afraid to try new things when it comes to your show and your website and your episodes. And don't get too crazy off script because it could, scare away your listener you already have listening to your show. But it's okay to kind of change things up and make it different and try new things. You never know. Something you think about doing and you do try it on your show, you might actually like it. And if the listeners seem to like it, then it's a win-win, right? But you never know if you never tried to do it. So today on Podtastic Audio, I had the privilege of talking to Rob Greenlee. Now, who is Rob Greenlee? He is a 2017 Podcast Hall of Famer. He's been in radio since 1999. He's actually been on XM radio before Sirius bought the whole damn thing. And he's also a podcaster himself with the New Media Show. So here is my conversation with Rob Greenlee.
Chris, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invite. It's an honor to join you.
Rob, man, this is fantastic having you on the show. Where in the world are you physically? I know you didn't fly into the studio today, although I usually do that, but, booking plans and stuff. But where are you coming to us from today?
I'm in Connecticut, so up in the northeast of the U.S. So I've only been up here for about 3 years or so. I used to be from Seattle, so I'm a transplant from the West Coast to the East Coast. So I'm excited to be out here. I'm fairly close to New York City, so I can bop down there and go to meetings and interface with the kind of the leading lights of podcasting, which New York seems to be kind of a little bit ground zero. I think Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, some of those are kind of the ground zero spots for podcasting.
Why do you say that for podcasting?
Why do I say that? Just because, a lot of the companies, a lot of media companies, a lot of podcasters, since those are highly populated areas of the country, typically have a lot of activity around podcasting. That's not to say that there isn't activity going on with podcasting outside of those areas. I do think that it's strong. Being from Seattle originally, I wouldn't consider Seattle to be a hotbed of podcasting, but it certainly is a hotbed of technology and some innovations in that area. There are podcasters up there. I was one of them for many years. So that's why I think that way. So if you're working professionally in the podcasting space, this medium is becoming more and more professionalized all the time. And, companies like Spotify and Apple and, of course, Apple's on the West Coast and kind of down in, the Silicon Valley area. So that's a significant area for podcasting as well. But that's why.
Now, you think with podcasting and with Apple, you would think a lot of the podcasting companies, media companies would be in Silicon Valley. That'd be their spot, But I guess you can do podcasting anywhere, right?
Yeah, that's true. And I think it's applicable now more than ever to include the rest of the world. So there's a lot of really interesting things going on, a lot of really terrific content, media companies, platform companies coming out of countries all over the world right now. I visited the podcast show in London this past spring. I went and I was a keynoter at the Radio Days Europe in Sweden. So there's a lot of activity going on in Europe and the Middle East. I was invited to present at an event in Saudi Arabia. I couldn't attend here recently. And so, there's just a lot of interesting things going on with podcasting all around the world now. And if you're a person that wants to learn more about that, I would definitely subscribe to the the Pod News newsletter at podnews.net, James Cridland has done a terrific job of kind of exposing the world of podcasting, not just the U.S. version of podcasting.
Now, when you talk to other places like Saudi Arabia and other places that do podcasting, do they do them in their own native tongue, or are we talking English podcasts, or what?
Yeah, I think if you look at it more on a global scale, and Saudi Arabia is it's a good example of what happens in a lot of countries around the world where there's a lot of English content that's consumed. I mean, if you think about it logically, there's more people outside of the U.S. that understand English, but maybe are challenged to actually speak it themselves.
No way. Yeah, my wife does the same thing. She says she can understand Spanish fluently, but she can't speak it very well, which I thought was kind of odd. But
right, so it goes both ways on that. But what you see happening in these countries is there's a lot of consumption of English content that's coming out of the United States and Europe, and but on the production side, these countries, most of the content that's being produced in those countries is typically in native language.
Yeah, that would make sense. And now, do you see that, like, I know that, like, when everybody thinks of podcasting, you think obviously it's American and it's English shows and stuff like that, but there's Spanish podcasts. I'm sure there's podcasts in different languages. Are you seeing like an upward swing with other countries, kind of like producing their own native tongue podcasts coming out and competing with the regular American podcasts?
Yeah, I think more and less. I think on that side, I think it depends on the popularity of the language, how widespread it is. Like Spanish is a good example. There's a lot of countries around the world that there's a lot of recognition and use of that language, and so shows that are produced in Spanish typically do better than maybe a show that's produced in Portuguese or something like that, just because of the potential audience is much larger in some languages than other languages, and that applies to English too. I mean, there's more people, like I said earlier, that understand English, so there's a lot more English consumption on a global scale than there is, let's say, any other language really, beyond maybe Spanish. Yeah.
Well, I do know now, maybe you can back me up on this fact or not. Is it true that if you have a podcast, say here in America, and if you put your podcast as explicit, like there's foul language, naughty words on it, that a bunch of countries will like ban or block your podcast from being played there?
Correct. Yeah. Certain countries around the world will not allow you to be included in catalogs that are available to those markets based on that check of that explicit tag. And those are kind of relationship things that have been established, like through Apple Podcasts and things like that the country that they engaged in with this catalog of content, the country has requested that the content that's available in their country, that type of content will be blocked from having access. And I think that there's a spectrum to this that kind of goes pretty wide. And if you think about what's happening in places like China and where there's restricted speech, that actually even goes to another level.
I'm not in China. I think any of my shows are in China.
Right.
So are podcasts in China at all, or are they all blocked?
I think my understanding is, and there's not a lot of engagement between the podcasting industry and China right now, just generally. I think there's been some interest in some content maybe is available over there, but it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, unless you are in that market to really know what's making it through the great firewall that they have or not. I know from a hosting provider standpoint, we don't really track consumption of podcasting in China through any of our stats platforms. I mean, it doesn't happen that much, and there isn't a lot of tracking of listenership going on in Russia either. So it's a little bit of a unfortunate situation that's developed for geopolitical reasons. And culture reasons, that this is still the case. I'm not saying that that's going to remain. I think Saudi Arabia is another good example of change, right? And we may see this change happen on a complete global scale when it comes to podcasting. Saudi Arabia has opted into, being more of a free speech environment, and they're allowing English content into the country more, and people within the country are able to feel like they can produce, some level above what it used to be of free speech, and they're encouraging podcasting in Saudi Arabia now. So there is a change in culture that is happening right now in Saudi Arabia per se. I can't speak specifically to what's happening in China by chance, but there's been a lot of progress in a huge country like in India.
I've heard they got their own platform, their own podcasting app, or what is it, a player or something?
They have a couple of listening platforms. One's called Ghana and one's GeoSavan, which are fairly large. Each one of them has user base in the 200 to 300 million range.
Wow, this is nice.
So you think about
chunk of downloads.
Yeah. So many podcasts have found some success in making their shows available, like through Libsyn or whatever. We did deals with those listening platforms to get Libsyn podcasters the ability to click a button and submit over to those platforms. And many podcasters saw a lift in listeners from submitting their shows over there. There's been a little bit of a lag in a show's ability to monetize those downloads.
Right. So what do you do with downloads from India? Like, how would you monetize that for an advertisement standpoint?
Well, it depends on the advertiser, and it depends on the advertising campaign and the deal that you strike. But most advertising right now, and it's expanding fairly rapidly, most of it is U.S. only. So if your downloads are in the U.S., more and more we're seeing it expand out to downloads in Canada and downloads in Europe and things like that. So we're starting to see, as those relationships develop with brands outside of the U.S., utilizing like programmatic advertising technology or dynamic ad insertion technology, that those brands outside of the U.S. can start buying campaigns into shows that are being listened to, like maybe they're a U.S. show that's listened to in Spain or something like that, and they will hear an advertiser from a Spanish brand.
Nice. That's as it should be,
Yeah, versus hearing a U.S. brand that is aired because it's embedded in the content, which is what has been going on for many years now.
But what if it's a host-read ad? Then the host has to do one for every country or whatever town or whatever it is,
Yeah, that's true. And that's one of the reasons why host-read advertising is a little bit on the decline right now.
It is? I thought they were on the upcline because it's more personal.
Well, it's still a strong revenue area for U.S. advertisers because they prefer baked-in advertising, host-read baked-in advertising, just because they feel like it drives a higher return on investment for them.
Right, yeah.
And that's a complicated question to kind of parse out, but basically they're buying a campaign that is unlimited is kind of what it is, because those episodes live with the baked-in ad for some period of time, even after the campaign has been completed. So they're getting benefits of that advertising beyond the window that they actually had contracted for, is what the benefit of that is.
Oh, yeah.
And that's slowly changing as the industry is evolving host reads into dynamic ad insertion, which means that those ads can be run through their campaign window and then either replaced or removed automatically from the content. So you can always have fresh content, or if you don't have an advertiser, there isn't any advertising, which is sometimes advantageous for a podcaster to just, have nothing versus having an old ad.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you're advertising something you did, but also you got to think about too, if the listener clicks push play on the podcast episode and they say this thing was released in, 2017, I think it's kind of user, you kind of expect that. But if the podcaster, I say, releases a new episode, but replays an old episode or whatever, and it just has that in there still, I think it's the podcaster should take that out if he's going to do a replay kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, that and even goes beyond that a little bit too, is that it's either an opportunity to have a new campaign in that content. It also,
totally.
Also depends on how evergreen the content is. Is it something that they're actively getting downloads? Are you actively getting a download of any significant number of an episode that you published in 2017 today, right? Are you getting 1,000 downloads a week on an old episode? Many shows don't have that kind of activity because they're either very timely type content, so podcasting networks and shows that have content that people continue to listen to regardless of when they were created are very valuable pieces of content, which makes sense, right? It's kind of like an audiobook, right? The value of that book doesn't necessarily decline that much over time, but it will to some degree.
Now, speaking of networks, you said you worked with Podcast One. Now, they are a network, right?
Yeah, they're kind of a complete thing. Yeah, I spent a year as their chief technology officer, and they had built their own podcast hosting platform, distribution and hosting platform, well as having their own ad sales team that was out there actively working with brands to drive advertising. Plus, they were a podcast production company, so they had their own studio and would bring in their own talent and contract with celebrities like Adam Carolla or Steve Austin or those type of folks, right?
So basically, they did everything in house. So there was no. If you do everything in house like that, can you pretty much do whatever you want? Like, there's no.
Yeah, you can. They even had their own apps for Android and iOS, and I managed those apps for a period of time. So they were a listening platform to some degree as well. So,
but as far as I know some people, if you do very hurtful, threatening things, on any platform, whether it's YouTube or obviously YouTube and, podcasting, is that you can be deplatformed. But can you not be deplatformed if you own the entire production stuff like Podcast One did?
Well, you can still be pulled down from, let's say, Apple Podcasts, or you can be pulled down from Spotify. We didn't have that control. Obviously, if those platforms decided to pull a piece of content down off of their platform, that was kind of like their choice for their distribution. But that's the power of open RSS, is that you can, and we've seen this happen with the Alex Jones podcast as well.
Right, yeah.
That got deplatformed and taken down off of all the major listening platforms, but yet at the end of the day, he still had it as RSS feed, right? So he still was able to be found online through his website. And also a person could cut and paste the RSS feed that he had and put it into a podcast catcher and still get his show every week. So
is that how you have to do it if you don't have an actual, if you're not sending it over to Apple or Spotify direct like most of us do? If you had to do it the old school way, so you have to copy and paste the RSS feed, and then you have to manually put it into what? Like Apple?
Many of the apps, the podcast listening apps, will support external feeds, which means that you just get the RSS feed link off of the podcaster website and you just cut and paste it into the listening app, and voila, you got access to all the episodes just as though it was in the catalog built into the app. See, a lot of people, because this is kind of a practice that was kind of early in the podcasting medium, is that flexibility was always there, because not all of the listening applications in the early days of podcasting had all the podcasts in them. So the industry hadn't been developed like it is today, where Spotify has like 4 million shows and Apple has like 2.5 million shows. In the early days of the medium, some of these listening platforms only had like maybe 2,000 or 3,000 shows, but yet there was 10,000 available. They just hadn't been submitted or accepted into the catalog that was included in the listening app.
Was it a little harder to get in back then than it is now?
Well, it just wasn't as automated as it is now.
Right.
So things have definitely accelerated on the technological integrations that have happened between the hosting platforms and the listening platforms, where back then it was more like, manual submission into, it's the same thing I went through when I ran the Zune podcasting platform for Microsoft. That was kind of part of the Windows Phone and Xbox platform back in the day when we launched this Zune media player to compete with the iPod in the early days. And so
I remember
my catalog at the peak when I was working on Zune, and this was just back in, I stopped working on the listening platform Zune in 2014. And that was, I think my catalog back then was about 50,000 shows, something like that.
That's nothing compared to today.
Right. If you compare that to where we are today, it's just a drop in the bucket. But even back then in 2014, Apple probably had 100,000 shows.
Right. I thought Apple owned the podcasting world because of podcasts, iPod, that sort of thing. That's why everybody thinks that it was all about Apple. It was an Apple thing, No,
it really wasn't. I mean, I think that Apple was a revolution to podcasting. There was no question. Their decision to early on through Steve Jobs and what they were seeing happen, the whole phenomenon around the downloadable MP3 files and things like that for music, really kind of put them in the mindset. So I think like a Napster type of a service in the early days really kind of opened people's eyes to the opportunity of distributing MP3 files of audio. So, you think about music and then you think about spoken word, and those tend to gravitate along the same pathways. Through back in those days, there was BitTorrent, which was kind of like a file sharing kind of platform. So there was a lot of kind of innovation happening around digital media distribution back then, and podcasting really kind of tapped into that. And podcasting was born about 2 years before Apple got involved in podcasting. So I was hand coding RSS feeds when I started.
Look at that.
With my radio show, because there wasn't a Libsyn or a Podbean or a Buzzsprout back then.
So you worked in radio? When did you start doing that?
Well, I started on the radio in 1999. So I walked into a radio station up in Seattle and asked them if they had a technology talk show. And I was all into the web and the internet in the early days. And
that was probably the internet in 1999. I think the internet was already out for maybe 4 or 5 years mainstream. But I think 99 was probably when I think there was a time where the computers, most people, I suppose a time when a good chunk of America had a computer, and almost all of them wanted to be online. Probably around 95, maybe 99, probably around the time.
It was America Online and that time frame, right?
And I think the MacBook, or not the MacBook, the original iMac came out around that same time. I think 98 was when that came out. So you came in 99, so right after that.
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, it was towards the kind of final collapse of the .com era, as when.
Oh, that's right.
So from 99 to about 2001 is when the internet really kind of went through its first death cycle.
Now, why do you think it did that? What was it? Was it kind of like everyone was just buying .coms that didn't exist?
Well, the early days of the internet and the web were a lot of hype and not a lot of substance. So I think at the core, that's kind of what was going on, and things have changed on that now. I think most of what's happening in the internet is full of substance now. It's a real thing. Back then, it was a lot of hopes and dreams and
I'm going to sell you on something that might happen, but it's
right, exactly. And that's kind of why I got involved in doing the show that I did. It was called the Web Talk World Radio Show. It was basically a show that was exploring the mysterious aspects of the development of this cyber culture of the internet, and back in those days, there was a mystique around it. They were making movies and talking about cyber culture, and there was the X-Files and the hackers and all this kind of cultural shift that was happening around this concept of connected devices and how computers, PCs were going to be on everybody's, going to involve everyone. People were still connecting really to the internet at work, not so much at home. in that time frame.
Right.
So
libraries had internet feeds at their library consoles.
Right.
Like I had to go to a library, like a public library of some sort, or college library, to actually use the internet. We didn't have a computer at home. We finally got one, but it had like that dial-up modem. I think it was like super slow. You know what I'm talking about.
It was very slow. Right. So that's when I started doing this, was when we were still on dial-up modems. And what you started to see happen, there was a company called Real Networks, or Progressive Networks was the term of it. And it was a company based up in Seattle that started out making a media server type of a platform that would be able to deliver audio and video over the internet.
No way.
Yeah. And they were the ones that really kind of pioneered this stuff of getting media to be distributed via streaming back in those days, because we were all connected on very slow internet connections. So we had to trickle the content.
I remember that. Yeah.
Right?
I know there was like a new, I think it was when Star Wars episode 1 or 2 came out. They had a trailer online, but my parents had like super slow internet. So I had to like trickle in the files. Like it was that little download little window thing on Windows where like the little folder would like look like it was flying over from one box to the other box kind of thing. And then it would do that for like about an hour. And then it was done. I could watch the 2-minute trailer.
Yeah. So we kind of, think back now and we kind of laugh at all that, because it seems so silly, right? That we had to, wait for a 5 megabyte file to download over half an hour or something like that. And that's kind of what was going on back then. So that's when I started making my radio show that I had available as an MP3 download off my website. So you could just click on a link in the browser and, initiate a download of the media file of the radio show that I was doing. So I was starting to embed that more and more in written articles and off of my website, and then would take sections of the radio show that I did. It was like an hour-long show, a typical show that was talking about all sorts of issues.
That's with commercials, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Back in those days, I left the commercials in there. Not all the episodes that I did back then were sponsored, but many of them were, and I was working with internet kind of startup companies back then to, like a web.com or a security company. And I would have like guests on from like Symantec and Microsoft and Real Networks and Oracle, and some of these folks that would come in and talk about some innovations that they're working on, like maybe broadband connections. We were speculating about the future of wireless internet and things like that back in those days, because Wi-Fi was still kind of a new thing.
Oh, that's then. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that kind of technological development was really what the focus of the show was, but also was really about kind of the culture of the medium too. So like I had a couple of co-stars from the X-Files TV show.
No way.
On the show as well. Yeah. To talk about that hacker culture and to talk about the series, and there was movies out, with Sandra Bullock.
Yeah.
Right. So playing into that whole kind of culture and that was developing a lot of interest in the growth of the internet, and then slowly evolved the radio show into doing more digital distribution. So I started working with kind of what I call precursor platforms that were making media files available for download, not unlike what I was doing off my website, and not unlike what podcasting turned out to be, was a digital download medium, right?
So you actually could physically download the file to whatever device you had, and you could play it on your own time.
Right. Right. In the early days, and I'm talking about like 2002 to 2001, 2002, 2003, just prior to podcasting, there were these new proprietary platforms that developed, and one of them was developed by Microsoft called Sync and Go, and it worked between Windows XP and the Pocket PC devices, which were just like an iPad or an iPod. But
it was like the Windows version of that, right? Not the Apple. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. It had like a touch screen and things like that. And it was like a version of Windows that was running. It was the Windows CE platform back in those days. But this platform they built called Sync and Go basically synchronized audio and video files from your Windows XP computer that was docked to a Pocket PC device, and there was a compatible piece of software in the Pocket PC device and a piece of software on the Windows XP that would synchronize. They had like 13 content providers, video and audio. And so you could subscribe in the software on Windows XP and then have it automatically transfer the media files over to your Pocket PC device. Pick up your Pocket PC device and listen to the radio show or watch video on your Pocket PC device.
Wow, the future is here, man.
Right. Well, and they had that before podcasting was invented.
Wow.
They were doing that. And I was getting paid to have my radio show available on that platform. I was one of the 13 content providers.
Well, look at you.
And they paid me, Microsoft paid me 25 cents per download of my radio show.
How many downloads were you getting on like a new episode released?
I was making about $5,000 a month on
Get
that
out
platform.
of here. Back in those days?
Yeah.
No way.
And all people were doing was transferring my radio show MP3 file.
So you're already
Windows XP.
You were already getting paid to be on for the radio show at that point too, from the station? And then you got paid for this too?
No, I was for the radio station. At one point, I was on 13 broadcast radio stations, and then I was also on the XM Satellite Radio Network for 2 years with the show as well, and then was streaming live on windowsmedia.com and streaming live in as many places as I could get the show on, and then working with like Microsoft on this Sync and Go project, and then there were other ones. There was another platform called Serenade, which was trying to do a lot of the same kind of stuff too, which was a precursor to podcasting. And then when podcasting started, it just so happened it aligned with the creation of a new website that I had created for my radio show, and it included a blog. And blogs have RSS feeds, right? So for me, it was very easy to just add the enclosure tag to the RSS feed, and voila, I was podcasting. So
look at that. Well, check that out. So we'll go back to the radio. When you were on satellite radio, were you there before Sirius bought XM, or they did the merger?
Yeah. Back then, it was just XM is what I was on back then.
They came first, if I remember correctly, right? And then Sirius came out second, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And I got on there through a relationship with CNET Radio, which is a big kind of tech review company out of San Francisco.
Yeah,
called
I know.
CNET. Yeah.
Oh,
so they had purchased 2 radio stations, one in Boston and then one in San Francisco. And so I was on those broadcast stations in those markets as well as on the XM Satellite Radio Network.
Well, that is fantastic. So you left obviously before Sirius took ownership. And what are your thoughts on them merging like that? I mean, competition, it seemed like there wasn't much,
Yeah, I think, satellite radio has never really penetrated that far into people's use. I think radio still dominated for most of that time. I think satellite radio has a place, but I think it's really kind of being replaced in a lot of ways by digital audio streaming and podcasting.
Right.
I think I'm not sure it has a strong future. And I know that the Sirius XM platform today is, I think, transitioning more over to regular digital distribution as well. So I think they see the handwriting on the wall on that.
Well, my dad's been a loyal Sirius subscriber since forever. I stopped mine when I got a new car and they gave you the 3 months for free. I'm not updating it, whatever. But for me personally, I just think it's expensive for what you get. And I mean, unless you live in like a nowhere town, in the middle of nowhere with no radio signal or something, or even an over-the-road truck driver, I'd probably have it for that. But local in a major market like this, I just don't see the value of it. And especially now with podcasting and, like you said, Spotify and all kinds of different stuff. Apple Music has their own like radio shows too, with musicians and all kinds of great, and they sound great. I think they even cost less than the monthly subscription to a satellite radio. I think, what is it now? Like $20, $30 a month?
Yeah, it's expensive. Yeah.
I mean, for that, I remember when CDs were about, $20 when you buy a CD album or whatever. Yeah. But speaking of podcasting here, what do you think you mentioned the future of satellite. So what's the future of podcasting, you think?
Well, I think it's just going to keep expanding. I think the big growth right now is happening outside of the U.S. On the listening side, and we're seeing some markets around the world have stronger per capita listening consumption to podcasts than the U.S. has. So there's definitely a little bit of a different culture outside of the U.S. around podcasting because it developed a little later in the game to some degree. So it kind of learned from all of the stuff that happened in the U.S., but it also is a lot of those places around the world have a different media culture than the U.S. had. The culture really focuses on, it's more of a public radio model. So if you think about NPR here in the U.S., that was a very critical part of podcasting. When podcasting started, National Public Radio was very early to podcast support. Actually, the same people that built Libsyn as the hosting platform, and many people will know the Libsyn name. I've been there as well. I've worked there and all that stuff. And the same founders, and I knew these guys, created the first podcast distribution platform for National Public Radio.
Oh, check that out.
They built Libsyn back in 2004. So that's when all this kind of really started. Prior to 2004, if you were a podcaster, you had to hand code your RSS feed or work with a little software program that auto-generated the RSS feed for you that then you copied and pasted up to your server. So it was very geeky in the early days. And that's why a lot of, white male geeks, technologists were the early podcasters, is because it took that kind of skill and knowledge to be able to get an episode out. So and then when Libsyn started, it basically built a software services type of platform to enable anybody to come in and really create a show.
Well, all of these platforms do that these days. I'm sure you've heard of a little one called Anchor. I'm sure you've heard of them. I mean, they make it super easy. All you need is a smartphone. You don't even need like a computer. I mean, you could do the entire show, edit, post, whatever, all right on your phone. I wouldn't recommend doing that if you care about audio quality.
Yeah, right.
I mean, at all. I mean, maybe you don't. Maybe it's your thing. I don't know. But I know with everybody makes it so much easier. I know when I got started in podcasting, I kid you not, because I didn't know any of this stuff, is that the very first thing, I took my little MP3, first episode 1, and I opened up iTunes on my PC, on my computer. And I said, okay, where do I drop this off at? Like, where's like the drop off section for, because I knew podcasting was through Apple. That's how I got it. But like, where do I upload this? Because I thought it was like YouTube, because I knew how to upload a YouTube video. I've done it before, but the fact that he had to go through an RSS feed, and I was like, RSS feed? What does this even mean? What are they talking about?
Yeah.
And then I had to like research that and it said audio media host. I'm like, what? There's another step to I just want to make a podcast. I don't want to think. I just want to make it and listen,
Right.
So I don't want to go to school and I had to learn this stuff. So I had to go through all these hoops to figure out how to do it. Once I figured it out and I got it going and kind of figured it out. And the podcast host that I went with the Chris and Christine show is not considered one of the best ones, but it was one that I kind of heard of, like name brand wise, like I heard of them. So I kind of went with them, with SoundCloud, which I know they're not the best for podcast hosting, but when I did it at the time, I heard of them. So I'm like, I know that. I've heard of that company. So that's where we landed, was just because of there. And I knew nothing about nothing at the time. So, but yeah, I mean, podcasting, I've been doing it for a little while, not as long as you, of course, but I have so much fun recording and editing and sending it out and listening back and hearing the reactions from the audience, what they like and feedback. And I just love this stuff so much. So when it comes to like, say, making, like, I know you've been podcasting for a while, but what makes a really good podcast versus a bad podcast, in your opinion?
Well, it's like any other content. That's the X factor that is hard to really forecast what's going to work and what's not going to work. So it's the combination of a person's personality, a combination of one's knowledge, one's passion, how dedicated they are to the community that they're building. And that's really kind of at the core of this is that to have a successful podcast means that you have built connections to other people. And you've built kind of a trust connection that those people want to hear your thoughts and care about your thoughts. how those thoughts might improve their lives or just entertain you.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think at the core, it's an X factor that makes a show, and timing makes a show successful or not. What's your topic? How relevant is the topic to people in general? Is it helpful? Is it hurtful? Is it driving some emotion? I think those are all key factors in whether or not a show is successful or not. And thus you should think about those aspects of what you're doing. Now, granted, there's nothing wrong with creating a show that you have a passion about or a topic that you think about every day and that you care about, that there's maybe a small amount of people out there that are like-minded, right, to that topic. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that. But you have to be cognizant of expectations too. I mean, because certain genres of content and certain topics and certain approaches to content have more or less audience access or appeal, might be a better way of saying it.
So you're saying, like, don't try to promote with your family and friends your earthworm breeding podcast?
Well, the example I like to give is the underwater basket weaving podcast.
That too, yeah.
Do you really want to do a show like that? It's going to appeal maybe to a half dozen people that really want to understand how to basket weave underwater in a pool. But it could be a parody podcast, right? That might be entertaining. So I think it depends on the creativity that you bring to what you're doing.
I think you have to be
degree.
A little bit creative. You know, I think some podcasters lack that. They probably just
don't
read,
take it too seriously, right?
Yeah. Right. And they just read a written book. They just read script or whatever they've written down, and they stick to it. And it just they have this very monotone speech pattern that just, you can tell they're reading. I can tell you're reading. Even how much editing you do, I can tell you're reading. And there's no energy, there's no excitement, there's no personality. I think what I've kind of learned to figure out is that it makes a really good show, I think, is entertain and educate. If you can do both at the same time, like very well, then you got them, but like I said, timings too, you don't know. And also too, it's like you think about these things, maybe they'll listen to this show because of this, but then no one really gravitates to it. And you're kind of like confused, like, why isn't anyone listening to my show? I hear that a lot too. And everybody seems to think that different ways to strategize. Like maybe it's the marketing, maybe I need to market better. So if you are a new show or you're going to give advice to, like, say, a newer podcast about marketing their podcast, what would you tell them?
Well, I would really focus on trying to build connection with audience in any way you can. Connect with people in the real world in any way you can. I think is kind of like a core principle because this is a people medium. I mean, it's about connecting with people, and I know that's been difficult during the last couple of years with the pandemic and the lockdowns and things like that. But I think that's really important. And then to create kind of feedback processes as much as you can. Sometimes it can be hard to get those feedback loops established with your audience and things like that. And I'm a firm believer is that fake it till you make it on that.
Yeah, definitely.
So even if you have to make up some of that stuff at the beginning, just to let people know that you're serious about, being interested in what your audience thinks and what the feedback that they have for you.
Wait. You're saying, like, if somebody, like, say you have like a feedback email, but you just kind of make one up?
If you're not getting one, just make one up potentially, just to let your audience know that you're serious about doing that. And
does that work? I know it's an old radio trick. Does it work?
I think it can. I think it depends on how you do it. It needs to come across as, it's probably good to maybe talk to a relative or something like that and have them write it for you, so you're not actually writing it or something like that.
Right.
Or a spouse or, a sister or something like that can write it in a way that can
it doesn't sound like you you said it or you wrote it or whatever like that. Yeah, I get that. I totally get that. I would say go right ahead. I've heard about that stuff too. I know a lot sometimes on the radio back in the day that they wouldn't have even fake callers called in.
Right. You could do that too. I mean, like Click and Clack, this is a classic example.
My dad loves that show. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's not around anymore, but there's archives out there. It's the Car Talk guys.
Right. Yeah.
A lot of people don't realize this, but every caller that they have in that was pre-scheduled, pre-booked, and pre-recorded.
No way. Check that out.
So you could create like a talk program like that, and have it all scheduled and pre-recorded and then just aired at a certain time. It doesn't have to be truly live. But it's a way of kind of communicating to your audience your seriousness of their engagement. Right. And you need to support that in as many ways as you can. And then more and more in the industry today, podcasters are having to really focus on cross promotion with other podcasts. And then even to the point of advertising, trying to run campaigns off of various listening apps to drive attention to their shows. But the core principles of marketing apply here. You need to focus on building your brand and as a host and as a media creator and getting on other shows as a guest, like what we're doing here. And doing things like that kind of builds community and awareness of your presence and showing leadership in whatever that topic genre that you're in, and being accessible. And I think those are all key principles, and it's not easy, and it sometimes takes time to build these networks, but creating content in other mediums as well is also important. I still think that being involved in social media is important, but it's not going to be the core driver of your audience. It's these other principles that I'm talking about that are going to be probably more important to driving audience growth.
Really? Because I've heard like it's a combination of all these kind of things, and especially with social media. And I do know that
it's part of the mix. It's part of the mix, but it's not. There isn't a lot of evidence of you putting a post for your show in Twitter driving a lot of audience to your show. It's more like you're catering to your existing followers with that, which is great.
Right,
but it's not also finding new people.
Well, I try to have people share it and retweet it and things of that sort, and more people retweet and it kind of expands your audience, potential audience, expand it just a little bit more than your little circle of friends or whatever. But when it comes to marketing, I know that on some platforms, I'm sure all of them that I think about it, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, they do have an option to pay to promote a tweet or a post or whatever.
Right. Boosting it. Right.
I know that there are some podcasters that do that. They do pay maybe a couple of days on Twitter, they'll pay the promotion. What are your thoughts on that? And does it really work?
Well, I think it should be probably part of an integrated kind of campaign of sorts. I think it may have benefits as a percentage of your marketing outreach that you have, but getting people, these concepts now that are being shared are like feed drops and cross promotions between shows and things like that are proving more and more to be viable ways of building audience. And they're really nothing new. I mean, they've been in podcasting. Now, feed drops as a concept has kind of been, that's relatively new. And,
can you expand on what a feed drop is to the audience?
Well, that's where you build a relationship with another show or as part of a network, right? Where you basically have like a content sharing agreement with that other show that maybe a particular podcast puts out a new episode every Wednesday. And then occasionally through a relationship with another show, that those two shows will do like a swap of episodes where they'll instead of putting out just an episode on Wednesday, they'll put out this other show episode on like Sunday or something like that.
From the other podcast?
From the other show. It's almost like an episode swap of sorts.
Right.
So but you have to be very careful with this too, because the audience, you have to be respectful of the audience that you already have, right? That are going to see that episode, and they need to understand maybe why that episode is in their feed when they're subscribing to a different show, right? Because it's completely different content.
It could and different hosts and different sound. It could totally confuse them, and they're like, "What is this?"
So you need to kind of prepare that audience that this is coming, and that you feel like this episode that is available through this other show is of value to you because of the interest that you have, and that I have a relationship with this other show, and that I think you will get value out of this other show. So if both shows do that, then it can help both shows.
What about instead of doing like entire episode, why not doing like 10 minutes of it? You know, like a sample portion in your feed versus an entire, that way, I mean, what if the audience listening to show 1 isn't interested in show 2, but you give them a full episode of show 2, they would be like, oh, you're kind of pissing me. I mean, it could, like I said, it could piss off your audience. It could. And there's very much a danger of that. So it has to be treated with a lot of respect. And it could be that the right thing to do is each show produces a special episode of what they're doing that is shorter and maybe really focused on driving value that aligns with that other show. Right. So 2 similar shows should be best to work together. Like you wouldn't have like your basket weaving show with true crime. Maybe, I don't know.
Right. So that's one technique that people are playing with right now to see if there's some possibility. It's really, the core idea behind it is that you're basically marketing to existing podcast listeners, and that's considered to be a much warmer market for growth than as opposed to reaching out kind of more generically to maybe people that aren't regular podcast listeners and spending money to market to those type of people out there that maybe haven't discovered podcasting yet, but you're spending money to drive people to discover podcasting, even beyond just, that they may already be existing podcast users and you're just trying to pick them up as a listener. So,
Right. Well, I know that they do say that YouTube is a great place to probably discover podcasts because most people, whether they're there for podcasting or, I mean, first off, people go to YouTube probably not for podcasting, probably go there for other things, but...
Well, they're going there to find content that's relevant to what their interests are and what they're looking for.
And if a podcast or something pops up in there...
That's a good thing.
It's a good thing and all that great stuff. So what are your thoughts on like a video podcast versus a strictly an audio podcast? I mean, I know everyone's kind of going towards this video platform, but is it necessary to do that for a podcaster?
Well, I think that there's definitely some advantages to having a video version of your podcast. I think it depends on your skill level, your abilities to be able to merge those concepts together and do them simultaneously. Some people are better on audio than they are on video. Some people can maybe need to start out with just audio and develop their content and their programming and then add video at some point in the future. So I think that there's also a lot of content that's up on YouTube right now that's perceived as being a podcast, but it's not technically an RSS-based podcast, right?
Right. I just told somebody yesterday on Twitter about that. I said, I hate when people call their YouTube channel a podcast.
Right. But that's common, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that. I think the industry likes to push back on this concept of podcasting is just distribution via RSS. There's a certain faction in the industry now that was like, well, that's closed-minded because listeners don't care and all this stuff. And my pushback on it is that, well, if you're a content creator, you should care.
Right.
But if you're a listener, you probably, as a podcast creator, thinking about a listener, I shouldn't care, right? I mean, if that listener wants to find me on YouTube, more the better, right? But I need to be there in order to be found. So that's what I need to think about. And I think as a podcast creator, as you look to the future, I do believe video is going to continue to be more important, growing in its importance to be in both places. So whatever strategy you take with your podcast, I think it's perfectly fine to start with just audio, but eventually you're probably going to need to figure out a way to add some sort of video component to what you're doing. It may not be the same content. It could be a little different content over on the video side. There's TikTok, there's YouTube, and there's
those
Facebook and
YouTube Shorts
and
yeah.
Right.
So what do you think about making it's just a quick little like, hey, this week's episode, like just using your phone, like, hey, this week's episode, like on video. We're going to talk about X, X, Y, Z, whatever. Here's the link, be out Friday or whatever. Just something like that. Would that be considered kind of the same thing you're talking about?
I would tend to gravitate more towards trying to deliver on some value with that, and then just dropping the mention that there's a new episode coming out. So take some part of your episode that you're going to put out, right, that you want to promote, and kind of give a little deeper tease on that, right? Share a little bit of value on that in that little video. And then if you want to, hear more about this topic, go listen to the podcast. So you want to deliver some value in the content that you're producing on any of these platforms, not just a tease for a coming episode.
Oh yeah, coming up Friday, new episode. Check it out. That's all you got.
Yeah, that's not enough. I think you have to actually drive value in that piece of content that you're producing there that's different.
I agree. I couldn't have said it better. That's fantastic, So last thing I have here is that you have your podcast that you do it every single week. The new media show?
Correct.
Yeah. Is it once a week or every day, or how do you guys do that?
It's every Wednesday. So we did go through a period during the pandemic where we did it twice a week. So we did it like on Saturday and Wednesday. And then we cut back to just doing it once a week on Wednesday, like 6 months ago or something like that. But that show is actually done live on stage at podcasting events all over the country. So Todd and I will do it like it's a panel session at Podcast Movement or Podfest or whatever. Matter of fact, I just traded emails with Podfest coming up here in the end of January down in Orlando, where we're going to get up on stage and do the new media show live on stage with guests. So it'll be like a panel session. So I've been doing that for probably 4 or 5 years now.
That's great.
Doing the show live in front of a live audience.
How's that feel? Is it different?
It's great. It's great. I just did it at Podcast Movement up on stage as well. And I've done it at the NAB show in Las Vegas. Actually, I did 2 90-minute live shows from the NAB show, which is the National Broadcasters Association conference. So I've been trying to, put into practice what I preach, and that's to get into the real world and get in front of real people. But all these events are also live streamed as well on the video side up to to YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, all those simultaneously. And oftentimes they're the only publicly live streamed event from these podcasting conferences. So it's been something that's really been cool to work on. And
I've always wanted to go to a podcast event, whether it's Podfest or whatever, whatever it's close by in the area. Like I've always wanted to go to one of these kind of things, and I just never have, and I've heard, now this is what I've heard from people who have gone to these, that these big events like this aren't really tuned for more of the smaller independent podcasts. Is that true?
I would say Podfest down in Orlando is really the one that really caters the most to the independent podcaster community. I think Podcast Movement started out like that, but it has really moved and evolved towards being more of a corporate event.
Yeah, that's what I heard.
Yeah. And then the podcast show in London, I was at this past spring, is a little bit more in line with what you're saying with Podcast Movement. It's very much a kind of a corporate podcasting, corporate media type of an event. It's squarely focused on podcasting. So don't get me wrong. It's not like it's like something different, but it just caters to a different segment of the community is what it does.
So you're saying so Podfest would be the one that independent shows would probably get more value out of?
Yeah, that's the event that's been historically relevant to independent podcasters, ones that are new or ones that are solo type podcast producers, that kind of thing.
Wow.
But more and more, this industry is professionalizing. So there's more people that are doing editing jobs, or they're selling advertising or whatever. But it tends to be a little bit more of a creator event, where Podcast Movement is really kind of your 360-degree view of the medium. There's a lot of people that go to Podcast Movement that don't do a podcast.
Oh, they're okay. I gotcha.
So
it's all about the nuts and bolts and the business, the behind the scenes scene stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah. The sales team's probably there and all that fun stuff. Showing out new sales pitches and all that fantastic stuff. Well, Rob, this has been so amazing having you on the show today. I really, really appreciated this today, man. Where can everybody find out all about you and all your wonderful stuff?
Well, it's pretty easy to do. I'm at robgreenlee.com, and that's with 2 E's on the end. That has links off to the podcasts that I do, and then has some articles up there too. And I'm on Twitter as well at Rob Greenlee. And then I do have my own show that I'm launching. It's called SpokenLifeShow.com.
Nice.
And then also I do the New Media Show, which we were just talking about, at newmediashow.com. But if you want to send me an email, you can certainly send me an email, rob.greenlee@gmail.com, and I can be reached there.
Fantastic. Well, Rob, you have yourself a fantastic rest of your day, buddy.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for having me on your program, and good luck with your podcast.
Thanks, man.